Mediterranean diet is arguably the healthiest way to eat. So, why are some people still skeptical of it? You might hear things like it's anti meat, or there's too many carbs. Aren't beans actually toxic, or isn't it too expensive? The reality is, there's a massive gap between the headlines and the science. So, today we're closing that gap and debunking the four biggest concerns that some people have with the Mediterranean diet. Okay, concern number one: is the Mediterranean diet anti meat? The short answer is no, it's not. Now, whether or not we should be eating meat at all, that's a bigger conversation. It's cultural, environmental, ethical, and that's not where we're going in today's video. But what we're talking about is how meat fits into the Mediterranean diet. So, if you've ever sat down to a traditional family meal in Greece, Italy, or Spain, you know that meat is absolutely there. It's just not there every day. And it's not showing up as ultra processed deli slices or fast food burgers. So the Mediterranean diet is not anti meat, but it does limit ultra processed meats. Now, decades of research consistently link ultra processed meats, things like deli meats, bacon, and hot dogs, with higher cardiovascular and cancer risk. That is well established. But unprocessed meats, they do fit within the Mediterranean diet. They're just not the main protein source. Fish is one of the main protein sources, especially fatty fish like sardines, anchovies, and mackerel. Now, just a side point, the Mediterranean diet does include traditional cured meats like prosciutto or salami. Thing is that these are often homemade or locally produced. They contain very few ingredients and little to no additives, which is very different from modern ultra processed deli meats. They're also eaten in small amounts, so moderation is the name of the game when it comes to these traditional cured meats. Okay, so now that we know the Mediterranean diet is not anti meat, what about vegetarians? Is the Mediterranean diet out of the picture? Well, no, you can customize the Mediterranean diet to include more non processed plant based proteins like legumes, peas, and eggs instead of meat. Okay, concern number two: what about all those carbs? Now, I know everyone loves to hate on carbs. And sure, if someone has intolerances, insulin resistance, or autoimmune conditions, you may benefit from adjusting your carb intake. But for most people, carbs are not bad. It's about context, quality, and quantity. And when people say the Mediterranean diet has so many carbs, I think sometimes they're picturing giant bowls of white pasta. But that's not the traditional pattern. Traditionally, it looks more like a small portion of whole grain pasta, often mixed with beans, vegetables, drizzled with olive oil, maybe a side of fish and salad. Carbs aren't eaten alone. They're part of a balanced plate. So what's the point here? You don't need to cut carbs. You just need to choose whole food carbs, pair them thoughtfully, and eat them in moderate portions. More on this in episode 6. And like we said in the outset, if you do need to reduce your carb intake due to your health condition, the Mediterranean diet can be customized. Okay, concern number 3. Are beans toxic? Now, this one pops up all over wellness spaces. You might hear things like beans are toxic or they have anti-nutrients. Is this true? Well, these claims often leave out one of the most important things, which is how we actually prepare and eat beans. Plant foods do contain these natural compounds in question, like lectins, oxalates, phytates, and others. But the concern with these almost always comes from looking at these foods in their raw, uncooked form. Okay, let's break it down and start with lectins found in legumes. Raw legumes contain lectins, and in certain contexts, lectins have been shown to alter gut function and lead to inflammation. But soaking and cooking legumes drastically reduces these compounds. Actually, to address this issue, Health Canada recommends soaking dried beans for a minimum of 5 hours, then boiling them in fresh water for at least 10 minutes, which is something that most people do without even really thinking about it. Now, if canned beans are easier for you, no problem. The heat treatment applied during the canning process is enough to significantly reduce lectins as well. So, the point here is that lectins are not really something the average person needs to stress about as long as you're cooking your beans properly. Now, what about oxalates in foods like beets and spinach? Well, the concern here is that if you eat too many oxalates, they can inhibit calcium absorption and may increase calcium kidney stone formation in some groups of people. So, yes, if you're at risk for kidney stones, you might need to limit or avoid some oxalate rich foods. But for the average person, eating oxalate rich foods in the context of a whole foods diet usually isn't a problem. Not to mention boiling, steaming, and pairing oxalate rich foods with calcium rich foods like spinach and feta can drastically reduce oxalate levels. So, again, The average person does not need to worry about oxalates. Lastly, phytates. What is the concern with these? Well, phytates are natural compounds found in foods like legumes and nuts. And you'll hear sometimes people say that they're a problem because they can significantly reduce absorption of certain minerals like iron and zinc. But here's the key thing to understand. Again, the context matters. In foods like beans and lentils, soaking, cooking, actually even pressure cooking, can dramatically lower phytate levels too. So when they're cooked properly, phytates are not a concern. Okay, but what about nuts? We mentioned that they have phytates too. Well, the thing is that most nuts are eaten roasted, which naturally lowers phytate levels. But even when they're eaten raw, the amount of phytates in nuts is small and not harmful, again, in the context of a balanced diet. Actually, phytates have an interesting purpose. Botanically speaking, legumes are seeds, and seeds are built to store nutrients for long periods of time. And phytates are part of that natural storage system. They help to stabilize those nutrients, which is one reason why dried beans last so long on the shelf. What's even more interesting is that phytates have antioxidant properties and have been studied for potential anti inflammatory effects. This is something that rarely makes it to the headlines. Now, the overall takeaway here is simple. When we properly cook legumes, anti nutrient levels drop significantly, while most minerals like iron and zinc remain available and absorbable. That's why properly prepared legumes are both safe and nutrient dense. And here's the bigger point: the Mediterranean diet isn't built on massive amounts of one plant food over and over again. It's built on variety, moderation, and traditional preparation. And in that context, these so called anti nutrients simply aren't an issue. And when we look at long term human data, diets rich in legumes, leafy greens, nuts, and seeds are all linked to lower rates of chronic disease. Now, if you want more information on this, stay tuned for episode 5, where we're going to be talking all about legumes. Okay, so that brings us to concern number 4. Mediterranean diet is too expensive. Thing is, historically, the Mediterranean diet was a peasant diet. So it was built on what was cheap and accessible, things like beans, seasonal vegetables, grains, local fish, and the occasional meat when it was available. Now, I know that whole foods can be expensive, especially with rising grocery prices. But here's the important thing to keep in mind: calorie for calorie, nutrient for nutrient. Whole foods offer more value than processed foods. So, a bag of lentils that costs a few dollars can make multiple meals. A carton of eggs, a head of cabbage, a can of sardines, these things go further than many packaged snacks. Mediterranean eating isn't about buying fancy ingredients, it's about shifting the proportions of what you already buy. So, fewer highly processed items and more simple whole food items. And when you do invest in things like extra virgin olive oil, I know that's expensive. Just think of that as an investment in your long term health. So, what does this all tell us? Well, these 4 concerns that people have can make the Mediterranean diet seem complicated, confusing, or expensive, when in reality, it's the opposite. It's simple, affordable, and linked to preventive health and longevity. Okay, this brings us to this week's Mediterranean style tip. When you eat carbs, swap refined carbs for whole grain carbs. So think white to brown. This could be whole grain bread instead of white bread, or brown rice or barley instead of white rice, or whole oats instead of breakfast cereals. Okay, now that we've cleared up those myths, we can really dig into the part that everyone wants to know. What should I eat on the Mediterranean diet? In the next video, we're going to be breaking down the first pillar, which is healthy fats, and why they're central to long term health. I'll see you in the next one.